The Alpha King told his brother exactly how he planned to get rid of her after the pup was born, not knowing she heard everything. Elena's hand trembled against the cold marble wall of the east corridor. She had come out for water, nothing more, her bare feet silent against the stone floor of the palace at midnight. But the moment she heard her own name spoken behind the heavy oak door of the private study, her feet stopped moving on their own. She pressed her back against the wall, heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. Inside the room, two male voices spoke in low, careful tones. One belonged to her husband, Alpha King Damien Ashgrove. The other belonged to his younger brother, Kian. "You cannot be serious," Kian was saying, his voice tight with disbelief. "She is carrying your child, Damien, your heir." "That is exactly why the timing matters," Damien answered, calm as still water. "Once the pup is born and the bloodline is secured, there will be no reason for her to remain here." Elena's fingers curled against the wall. She told herself she must have misheard. Surely there was some explanation, some context she was missing. But then Damien continued, and every hope she had quietly built over the past 6 months began to crumble. "I have already spoken to the Northern Pack about accepting her," he said. "It will be framed as a matter of her health, her need for rest after the birth. No one will question it. She will be given a modest home, enough coin to live comfortably, and she will never be spoken of at court again." "And the pup?" Kian asked. "The pup stays here, with me, as is proper." Elena's stomach turned. She pressed a hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. The child inside her, the same child she had begun to dream about, to hum quiet songs to in the private hours of the night, kicked gently against her ribs as if sensing her distress. "She trusts you," Kian said, and there was something almost pleading in his voice now. "She believes this marriage might become something real. I have seen the way she looks at you, brother." "Then she is a fool," Damien said simply. "I never promised her anything beyond what this marriage required. A truce, an heir, nothing more." Elena closed her eyes. The words landed like stones, one after another, each heavier than the last. She thought of the weeks she had spent trying to earn even a small piece of his attention, the nights she had waited by the window, hoping he might visit her chambers, might sit with her, might simply ask how she was feeling. She thought of the morning she had first felt the pup move, and how badly she had wanted to run and tell him, only to stop herself at his study door, unsure if he would even care. Now she knew the answer. "There are kinder ways to handle this," Kian said. "You could tell her the truth. Let her choose. And risk her fleeing before the birth? Risk the Northern Packs thinking me weak, unable to control my own mate?" Damien's voice hardened. "No. This is the only way that protects the pack, the bloodline, and the truce our father built. Sentiment has no place in it." Elena did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked as quietly as she could back toward her chambers, her legs unsteady beneath her, her mind spinning with a storm of disbelief and grief. By the time she reached her room and closed the door behind her, silent tears had already begun sliding down her cheeks. She sat on the edge of her bed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, and stared at nothing for a long while. The palace around her was silent, the kind of silence that seemed to mock her, as if the very walls had known this truth long before she had. She thought back to the day she first arrived at Ashgrove Palace, 7 months ago now. She had been sent from her home pack, a smaller territory far to the west, as part of an agreement between her father and King Damien's late father. Her pack was weak, recovering from years of conflict, and the marriage was meant to secure protection and peace. She had known, even then, that it was not a match born of love, but she had allowed herself to hope. She was young, and hope had always come easily to her, even in difficult circumstances. Damien had been polite to her in those early days, if distant. He escorted her through the palace, introduced her to the staff, ensured she had everything she required, but warmth never followed the politeness. He kept to his study, his council meetings, his training grounds, while she wandered the vast halls of the palace largely alone, save for the company of a few kind members of staff. One of them, a woman named Nora who oversaw the kitchens, had become something of a friend to her. It was Nora who first noticed the way Elena's spirits dimmed the longer she stayed at the palace, and Nora who gently encouraged her to be patient, to give the king time. "Some men take longer to open their hearts," Nora had told her one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, after the staff had gone to bed. Give him time, dear. He lost his father only a year before you arrived. He carries more on his shoulders than most know. Elena had clung to those words. She told herself that grief could make a person cold, that duty could make a person guarded, and that beneath it all, there might still be a good man worth waiting for. But sitting now on her bed, replaying the conversation she had just overheard, she understood how wrong she had been. Damien's coldness was not grief. It was calculation. He had never intended for this marriage to become anything more than an arrangement, and he had never intended for her to stay. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and forced herself to breathe slowly, the way her mother had once taught her to do, when fear threatened to overwhelm her. She could not fall apart, not now, not with a child depending on her. A knock came softly at her door. Elena quickly wiped her eyes again and smoothed her nightgown before answering. It was Nora, carrying a cup of warm milk, her expression concerned. "I saw your light was still on," Nora said, stepping inside. "Are you well? You look pale." Elena forced a small smile. "Just trouble sleeping. The pup keeps me awake some nights." Nora studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but she did not press. She set the cup down on the bedside table and gently squeezed Elena's shoulder. "Rest if you can. Tomorrow is a new day." After Nora left, Elena sat alone with her thoughts for a long while. She thought about confronting Damien directly, demanding to know if what she had heard was true. But something in her hesitated. If she revealed what she knew too soon, he would simply find another way, a quieter way, to carry out his plan. She needed to think clearly, not react in anger or heartbreak. She thought, too, about her own family, the pack she had left behind. Her father was proud but not unkind, and she knew that if she wrote to him now, in the state she was in, he would want to intervene, possibly in ways that could shatter the fragile truce between their territories. She could not risk that. Too many people depended on this peace remaining intact, herself included. For the first time since her arrival at Ashgrove Palace, Elena realized she was completely alone in navigating what came next. She would need to be careful. She would need to be patient. And she would need to be far smarter than anyone in this palace currently believed her capable of being. The following morning, Elena rose early, dressed with quiet purpose, and made her way to the private garden behind the east wing, a place she often visited when she needed to think. The morning air was cool, the grass still damp with dew, and the early light cast long shadows across the neat rows of flowering shrubs that Nora's staff maintained so carefully. She had barely settled onto her favorite stone bench when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned, expecting Nora, but instead found Kian walking toward her, his expression unreadable. "Lady Elena," he said, offering a small bow. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, keeping her voice steady, though her pulse quickened at the sight of him. She wondered, briefly, if he somehow knew that she had overheard the conversation the night before, but his expression gave nothing away. Kian sat down at the opposite end of the bench, close enough for conversation but respectful of the distance between them. "How are you feeling?" "The healers tell my brother the pup is strong and healthy." "I am well," Elena said, "tired, but well." Kian nodded, though something in his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for something beneath the surface of her calm exterior. "My brother does not say it, but he is relieved to hear the pup is strong. The bloodline matters greatly to him." Elena kept her expression neutral, though the words stung more than she let on. "Yes, I imagine it does." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Elena studied Kian carefully, remembering the way he had pushed back against Damien the night before, the discomfort in his voice when he spoke of the plan to send her away. Perhaps, she thought, there was more kindness in him than in his brother. Perhaps he could be useful to her, in time, though she would need to be careful about how much she trusted him. "You seem thoughtful this morning," Kian observed. "I suppose I am simply thinking about the future," Elena said carefully. "It is strange, being a mother soon. I find myself wondering what kind of life my child will have here." Something flickered across Kian's face, guilt perhaps, or discomfort, though he masked it quickly. "Your child will want for nothing, Lady Elena. That much I can promise you." "And me?" she asked, watching him closely. "What will I want for?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than she had intended it to sound. Kian's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, she thought he might say something revealing, something that would confirm everything she already knew. But instead, he simply offered a polite, careful smile. "You have a home here for as long as you need it," he said. It was not an answer, not really, but Elena did not push further. She had learned enough for one morning. She rose from the bench, offering Kian a small, gracious smile of her own. "Thank you for your company," she said. "I should return inside. The healers wish to check on me before midday." As she walked back toward the palace, she felt Kian's gaze on her back the entire way, and she wondered, not for the first time, how much he truly knew about his brother's plan, and how much guilt he was already carrying because of it. Over the following days, Elena forced herself to settle into a careful routine, one designed to give away nothing of what she now knew. She attended her meals as expected, spoke politely with the staff, allowed the healers to examine her, and even accepted Damien's brief, dutiful visits to her chambers each evening, where he would ask a handful of practical questions about her health and the pup's progress, before excusing himself. It took everything in her not to flinch when he touched her hand in greeting, not to let her voice waver when she answered his questions. She had always been a person who wore her feelings plainly, who found it difficult to hide sadness or hurt behind a calm face. But necessity, she was discovering, could teach even the most transparent heart how to build walls. One evening, as Damien sat across from her in her private sitting room, going through the motions of his nightly visit, Elena found herself studying him more closely than she had allowed herself to in months. He was undeniably striking, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp green eyes and dark hair that he kept neatly combed, though a single stubborn strand always seemed to fall across his forehead by the end of the day. His voice was deep and even, his manner composed in a way that suggested years of practice hiding whatever lay beneath the surface. She wondered, watching him now, whether there had ever been warmth in him at all, or whether duty and grief had long ago hollowed it out entirely. "You are quiet tonight," Damien observed, glancing up from the small notebook he carried, where he tracked details about pack matters even during these brief visits. "Just tired," Elena said, offering the same excuse she had given Nora days before. It seemed to satisfy him easily enough. He nodded and returned his attention to his notes. She studied his hands as he wrote, strong and steady, and thought of how easily those same hands had, only nights ago, sealed a plan to remove her from her own child's life, without so much as a flicker of hesitation in his voice. The contrast unsettled her more than she expected. "The healers say the pup is strong," Damien said after a moment, not looking up. "That is good." "Yes," Elena said quietly. "Strong." He glanced up briefly, something almost like relief passing over his features, before it vanished behind his usual composed mask. "Good," he said again, simply, before returning to his notes. Elena watched him a moment longer, then looked down at her own hands folded in her lap. She thought of the words she had overheard, the coldness with which he had spoken of sending her away, of keeping the pup while discarding the mother, as though she were nothing more than a vessel that had served its purpose. She thought of how easily he sat across from her now, asking about her health, pretending, at least outwardly, that theirs was a marriage built on some measure of care. The dissonance between the two Damiens, the one who sat before her now, and the one she had overheard in the study, left her feeling as though she were sharing her chambers with a stranger she had never truly known at all. When he finally rose to leave that night, pausing briefly at the door as he always did, he offered her the same polite farewell he gave every evening. "Rest well, Elena." "You as well," she replied, her voice steady, despite the storm still raging quietly beneath her calm exterior. After the door closed behind him, she sat alone in the dim light of her sitting room for a long while, one hand resting over the gentle curve of her stomach, feeling the pup shift and settle within her. She thought of the life growing inside her, a life that deserved better than to be used as a bargaining piece in a plan designed to erase its own mother. "I will not let him do this," she whispered to the quiet room, her voice barely more than a breath. "Whatever it takes, I will not let him take you from me." It was, she realized, the first moment since overhearing that conversation in the corridor, that her grief had begun to shift into something else entirely, something steadier, something sharper. Resolve. She did not yet know how she would protect herself, or her child, from the plan Damien had so carefully constructed. She did not know who among the palace staff or the pack council might be trusted, or how much time she truly had before the pup's birth set his plan into motion. But she knew, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that she would not simply wait to be discarded. Whatever Damien believed about her, whatever quiet assumptions he had made about her weakness or naivety, she intended to prove him wrong. Outside her window, the moon hung high over the palace grounds, casting silver light across the gardens below. Somewhere out there, beyond the palace walls, her own pack still waited for news of her, still believed her to be safe and cared for in her new home. She thought of her mother, long past, and the quiet strength she had always carried even in the pack's darkest days. She thought of her father, and the pride he had always placed in her ability to endure hardship with grace. She would need all of that strength now, and more. Elena rose from her chair and moved slowly to her window, resting her palm against the cool glass as she looked out over the moonlit grounds. Somewhere within this palace, she knew, there had to be people who did not agree with Damien's plan, people whose loyalty could perhaps be earned, if she was patient and careful enough in how she approached them. Kian's discomfort during their conversation in the garden had not gone unnoticed. Nora's kindness, freely given without expectation, suggested there might be others among the staff who would extend the same warmth, if given reason to trust her. And beyond the palace walls, her own connections, however distant they had become since her marriage, might still hold value she had not yet considered. She did not know, standing there in the quiet of her chambers, exactly what shape her plan would take. But she knew it would begin here, in this moment, with the decision to stop being the unsuspecting bride Damien believed her to be, and to start becoming something far more dangerous to his careful, calculated plans. A mother who would not be moved. The following weeks passed with deceptive calm on the surface of palace life. Elena continued her routines, her polite exchanges with Damien, her quiet mornings in the garden, her evenings spent in careful conversation with Nora over warm tea. But beneath that calm surface, she had begun, slowly and carefully, to watch, to listen, to learn the rhythms of the palace in ways she never had before. She noticed which guards seemed uneasy around the king, which members of the council exchanged wary glances during meetings she was occasionally permitted to observe, which servants spoke of Damien with genuine respect, and which spoke of him only out of obligation. She began to understand, piece by piece, that the palace was not the unified, loyal household it appeared to be from the outside. There were cracks beneath the surface, quiet tensions that had never been given room to breathe. And within those cracks, Elena began to see the first outline of a path forward. She did not yet know exactly what she would do with the knowledge she gathered, or how she would ultimately protect herself and her child from the fate Damien had planned for them. But for the first time since that terrible night in the corridor, she felt something other than grief settling into her chest. She felt purpose. And as the days passed and her belly grew rounder with the child who would soon change everything, Elena Ashgrove began, quietly and carefully, to prepare for the moment when the mask she wore each day would finally need to come off. 6 weeks had passed since the night Elena first heard the truth spoken in the study, and in that time she had learned to become someone new, someone who smiled at the right moments, asked the right questions, and gave away nothing of the storm she carried inside. But learning to hide her feelings was only the beginning. Now, she needed to learn something far more difficult. She needed to understand exactly how deep Damien's plan truly went, and who else might already be involved in carrying it out. It began with small observations. Elena noticed that a particular guard, a quiet man, named Edwin, who was usually stationed near the western gate, had begun appearing more frequently near her own chambers in the late evening hours. At first she assumed it was simple coincidence, a change in rotation perhaps. But after the third night in a row, she began to suspect something else entirely. Perhaps Damien had already begun arranging for her eventual departure, and Edwin's presence was part of some quiet preparation she was not yet meant to notice. She mentioned it carefully to Nora one evening, while the older woman helped her prepare a simple meal in the small private kitchen near her chambers, a space Elena had begun using more often as she grew increasingly wary of dining in the main hall, where Damien and his council so often gathered. "Edwin has been posted near your door most nights this week," Nora confirmed, not looking up from the pot she stirred. "I noticed it too." Do you know why? Elena asked, keeping her tone light, curious, rather than alarmed. Nora was quiet for a moment, her expression carefully neutral. I could not say for certain, but Edwin does not speak much of his duties. He is a careful man, loyal to the crown above all else. Elena absorbed this information quietly, filing it away alongside everything else she had gathered over the past weeks. Loyal to the crown, Nora had said, not loyal to Damien specifically. It was a small distinction, but one that Elena suspected might matter a great deal in the months ahead. That night, after Nora had left, and the palace had settled into its familiar evening quiet, Elena decided it was time to take a small risk. She dressed in a simple gray cloak, the kind worn by staff moving between wings of the palace after dark, and made her way quietly toward the western gate, where she knew Edwin would be stationed. She found him exactly where she expected, standing at attention near a narrow servant's entrance that led out toward the palace stables. He straightened immediately upon seeing her approach, offering a respectful bow. Lady Elena, is something wrong? Shall I fetch someone? No, nothing is wrong, Elena said gently, offering him a warm smile. I simply could not sleep, and thought some fresh air might help. I did not expect to find company out here. Edwin relaxed slightly, though his posture remained formal. The night air is good for clearing the mind, my lady, though perhaps you should not wander too far in your condition. You are kind to worry, Elena said, studying him carefully. Tell me, Edwin, have you served the crown long? Since I was a young man, my lady. My father served before me, and his father before him. Our family has always served the Ashgrove line. Then you must have known the old king well, Elena said, referring to Damien's father, whose death had left such a heavy mark on the current king's temperament, if the rumors were to be believed. Something shifted in Edwin's expression, a flicker of genuine feeling breaking through his professional composure. I did, my lady. A good man. Fair. He believed strongly that a leader's strength came from protecting those who could not protect themselves. He paused, seeming to catch himself before he said too much, and cleared his throat. Forgive me. I should not ramble. Not at all, Elena said softly. I find it comforting to hear about him. I never had the chance to know my husband's father. Edwin studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful in his gaze, before he spoke again, his voice quieter now. The old king would have liked you, my lady, if I may say so. He valued kindness. Valued it in a way not everyone in this palace shares. The words carried a weight Elena suspected was intentional, though Edwin offered nothing further, straightening once more into his formal posture, as though he had already said more than he intended. Thank you, Edwin, Elena said gently. I should return inside before I am missed. Good night. Good night, my lady. As she walked back toward her chambers, Elena turned Edwin's words over carefully in her mind. He valued kindness, valued it, in a way not everyone in this palace shares. It was not confirmation of anything specific, but it was enough to suggest that Edwin, too, harbored quiet reservations about the man currently ruling in his father's place. Perhaps his presence near her chambers each night was not part of Damien's plan at all, but rather a private, unspoken effort of his own. A quiet form of protection extended without permission or acknowledgement. The thought offered Elena a small, fragile comfort as she settled back into bed that night, though she knew better than to rely on assumptions alone. She would need more than quiet impressions and careful words if she hoped to build any real protection for herself and her child. She would need allies willing to act, not simply sympathize. The opportunity to test the depth of Kian's discomfort with his brother's plan came sooner than Elena expected. 3 days later, the palace hosted a modest gathering to celebrate the upcoming harvest season, a tradition Nora explained had been observed by the Ashgrove pack for generations. Council members, senior staff, and several visiting dignitaries from neighboring territories filled the great hall, and Elena, despite her growing discomfort at such gatherings, was expected to attend at Damien's side. She moved through the evening with practiced grace, greeting guests, accepting well wishes about her pregnancy, and maintaining the composed, dutiful presence expected of her. Damien remained close throughout much of the evening, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back, in a gesture that, to outside eyes, might have appeared affectionate, but which Elena now understood as simple performance, maintained for the benefit of watching guests. It was during a brief lull in the festivities, while Damien was pulled aside by a visiting dignitary to discuss trade matters, that Kian appeared at her side, offering to fetch her a chair, given the long hours she had already spent standing. "You are very attentive tonight," Elena observed, as he guided her toward a quieter corner of the hall, away from the densest crowds. "My brother would have my head if I allowed his mate to overexert herself," Kian said lightly, though something in his tone suggested more genuine concern than the joke implied. Elena settled into the offered chair, studying him carefully. This was, she realized, an opportunity she had been quietly waiting for. A private moment, where Kian's guard might be lowered enough to reveal more than he intended. "Kian," she said carefully, "may I ask you something honestly?" He glanced at her, something wary entering his expression, though he nodded, "Of course. Do you believe your brother capable of true affection? Not duty, not obligation, but real affection?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward Damien, who remained engaged in conversation across the hall, before returning to Elena. "My brother has carried a great deal since our father's passing," Kian said carefully. "He does not allow himself the luxury of affection easily. He believes it makes a leader vulnerable." "That is not quite an answer," Elena said gently, watching him closely. Kian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Elena had come to recognize as a sign of genuine discomfort in him. "I believe he is capable of it," he said finally. "I simply do not believe he allows himself to recognize it when it happens." Elena absorbed this, turning it over carefully. It was, she suspected, as close to an honest answer as Kian was willing to give, in a crowded hall full of watching eyes. But it told her something important nonetheless. Kian did not defend his brother's coldness as an unchangeable trait. He described it as a choice, one born of fear rather than absence of feeling entirely. "Thank you for your honesty," she said softly. "Elena," Kian said, his voice dropping lower, urgent in a way that surprised her. "Whatever you may sense from him, please know that not everyone in this palace wishes to see you unhappy." The words hung between them, heavier than perhaps Kian intended them to sound. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any sign that he might be closer to confessing what she already knew than he realized. But before she could respond, Damien's voice called Kian's name from across the hall, requesting his presence to settle a minor dispute among the visiting dignitaries, and the moment dissolved as quickly as it had formed. Kian offered her a small, apologetic bow before crossing the hall to join his brother, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts once more. "Not everyone in this palace wishes to see you unhappy." The words repeated themselves in her mind long after the gathering ended, and she retired to her chambers for the night. They were not a confession, not proof of anything specific, but they were, she decided, a thread worth following carefully in the weeks ahead. As the following days passed, Elena began to notice something she had not expected. Kian's small kindnesses toward her seemed to increase, subtle at first, then more consistent. He began joining her occasionally during her morning walks in the garden, offering easy conversation about pack history, local traditions, and eventually, more personal topics about his own childhood alongside Damien. "We were close once," Kian admitted during one such walk, several weeks into their growing cautious friendship. "Before our father's passing, Damien used to laugh more. He used to make time for things beyond duty." "What changed him?" Elena asked, genuinely curious now, beyond simply gathering information for her own protection. Kian was quiet for a long moment, his expression distant. "Our father's death was sudden, an illness that took him quickly. Before anyone had time to prepare, Damien was only 23 when he took the throne. He believed, and still believes, that any softness on his part would be seen as weakness by the packs who might otherwise challenge our territory's stability." Elena considered this carefully. It did not excuse the plan she had overheard, the calculated coldness with which Damien had discussed removing her and their child from his life. But it offered, perhaps, a clearer understanding of the fear that drove such coldness in the first place. "Grief can make people build walls," she said quietly. "But walls built from fear rarely protect the people building them, they only isolate." Kian glanced at her, something thoughtful and slightly sad in his expression. "You understand him better than he realizes, I think." "I understand fear," Elena said simply. "I have carried enough of my own." They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, and Elena found herself, despite everything, genuinely grateful for Kian's growing presence in her days. Whatever guilt he carried over his brother's plan, whatever loyalty still bound him to Damien, he had become, without either of them fully acknowledging it aloud, something close to a friend. But friendship alone would not be enough to protect her when the time came. Elena understood this clearly, even as she allowed herself the small comfort of Kian's company. She needed something more concrete, something that would give her real leverage should Damien attempt to carry out his plan once the pup was born. It was during a quiet afternoon in the palace library, several weeks later, that Elena found the first piece of what she needed. She had taken to spending her afternoons there increasingly often, using the excuse of researching pack history and traditions to prepare herself for eventual motherhood within Ashgrove territory. The head librarian, an elderly beta named Mr. Halloway, had grown fond of her quiet, genuine curiosity, and had begun setting aside older texts and records he believed might interest her. It was among these older records, tucked within a dusty volume detailing the founding laws of the Ashgrove Pack, that Elena discovered something unexpected. A clause, written generations ago by one of Damien's ancestors, that outlined specific protections for mates who bore an alpha's heir, protections that included guaranteed parental rights regardless of the marriage's continuation. Elena read the passage 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. If this law remained in effect, unaltered by any later ruling, it meant that Damien's plan to strip her of parental rights and quietly relocate her after the pup's birth would not simply be cruel, it would be illegal, a direct violation of the very laws his own family had established generations before. She approached Mr. Halloway carefully, keeping her tone light and curious rather than urgent. "This clause," she said, gesturing to the passage, "regarding parental rights for an alpha's mate, is this law still recognized today?" Mr. Halloway adjusted his spectacles, peering at the passage she indicated. "As far as I am aware, yes. It has never been formally repealed, though it is rarely invoked, given how uncommon it is for such disputes to arise within the ruling family itself. Has it ever been tested? Brought before the Pack Council?" "Once, many generations ago," Mr. Halloway said thoughtfully. "A dispute between an alpha and his mate, similar to what you describe. The council upheld the mate's rights, citing this very clause. It set something of a precedent, though, as I said, such disputes are rare." Elena felt something settle in her chest, a small but significant shift from helplessness toward something resembling real power. If Damien attempted to carry out his plan, she now had, however quietly, a legal foundation upon which to challenge him, one rooted in the very traditions his family claimed to honor. She thanked Mr. Halloway warmly, careful to keep her excitement contained, and made a private note of the exact text and location of the passage before returning the volume to its shelf. Walking back toward her chambers that afternoon, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, a small, genuine smile. She was no longer simply gathering scattered impressions and cautious alliances. She now held something concrete, something that could genuinely shift the balance of power when the moment came. She thought of the pup growing steadily within her, now large enough that she could feel distinct movements throughout the day, small kicks and shifts that had become a strange, comforting reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. "We are going to be all right," she whispered softly, resting a hand over her stomach as she walked. "I promise you that." The weeks that followed brought new challenges, new pieces of the larger puzzle Elena was slowly assembling. She began, carefully and without drawing attention, building a quiet network of allies within the palace, people whose small kindnesses and subtle discomforts with Damien's rule suggested a shared, if unspoken, hope for something better. Nora remained her closest confidant, though even she did not yet know the full truth of what Elena had overheard that night in the corridor. Edwin's quiet, consistent presence near her chambers continued, a silent form of protection Elena had come to trust, even without direct confirmation of his motives. And Kian, whatever guilt and conflicted loyalty he carried, had become an unexpected source of both information and genuine companionship. But Elena knew better than to grow complacent. Damien remained sharp, observant, and fully capable of noticing any shift in the careful balance she had constructed. She would need to continue playing her part perfectly, the devoted, unsuspecting mate, right up until the moment she chose to reveal what she truly knew. And that moment, she understood clearly, would need to come at precisely the right time, when her leverage was strongest, and Damien's plan closest to being set into motion. Not a moment before. As her pregnancy progressed and the palace healers began speaking more frequently of an approaching due date, Elena felt the quiet urgency of her situation sharpen with each passing week. Time was no longer an abstract concern. It was closing in, steady and relentless, carrying her toward a confrontation she had spent months carefully preparing for. She did not know exactly how events would unfold once the pup was born. She did not know how Damien would react when he discovered how much she truly knew, or how far he might go to maintain control over the situation. But she knew, with growing certainty, that she would not face that moment as the naive, unsuspecting bride he still believed her to be. She would face it as a mother, armed with knowledge, allies, and a legal foundation rooted in his own family's history. And she would not go quietly. The rain came suddenly. On the evening everything nearly fell apart, drumming hard against the tall windows of the palace, as Elena sat in the library, long after Mr. Halloway had retired for the night. She had returned to the old records more than once in recent weeks, cross-referencing the parental rights clause with other historical rulings, determined to understand every possible angle before she would need to use what she had found. She did not hear the study door open behind her. "You are here late." Elena startled, quickly closing the volume in front of her, and turning to find Damien standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. Her heart lurched painfully, and for one terrifying moment, she was certain he had somehow learned exactly what she had been researching. "I could not sleep," she said, keeping her voice steady, despite the sudden rush of panic beneath her calm exterior. "I find the history of the pack interesting. It helps me feel more connected to the place our child will grow up in." Damien's gaze drifted briefly to the closed volume beside her hand, before returning to her face. "Which text holds your interest tonight?" "Founding traditions," Elena said, offering the truth carefully wrapped in enough vagueness to avoid suspicion. "The early ceremonies, the naming customs." He studied her a moment longer, and Elena forced herself to hold his gaze, refusing to let her nerves show. Finally, something in his expression eased slightly, and he nodded, seeming to accept her explanation. "Mr. Halloway speaks highly of your curiosity," Damien said, stepping further into the room. "He tells me you have become quite the scholar of pack history." "I want our child to understand where they come from," Elena said, and this much, at least, was entirely true. Something flickered across Damien's face at the word "our," something Elena could not quite name, gone as quickly as it appeared. He moved to the shelf nearest her, running his fingers absently along the spines of several volumes, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "You have changed since you arrived here," Damien said finally, his voice quieter than she was accustomed to hearing from him. "You seem steadier, more settled." Elena's pulse quickened at the observation, uncertain whether it carried suspicion or something closer to genuine notice. "Motherhood changes a person, I suppose," she said carefully. "Perhaps," Damien said, though something in his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced by her explanation. He turned to face her fully now, his green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to remain still. "You are not the same frightened girl who arrived here 7 months ago." "Should I be frightened?" Elena asked, before she could stop herself, the question slipping out sharper than she intended. Damien's brow furrowed slightly. "Of what?" Elena held her breath for a moment, aware she had drifted dangerously close to revealing more than she intended. She forced a small, weary smile, softening the edge in her voice. "Of motherhood. Of everything changing so quickly." Damien's expression relaxed slightly, though something thoughtful remained in his gaze. "You need not be frightened of that. You will be a good mother, Elena. That much is clear to me already." The words, spoken with unexpected sincerity, caught her completely off guard. For a brief, disorienting moment, she found herself wanting to believe there was more warmth in him than she had witnessed that night in the study, wanting desperately for the man standing before her now to be the truth, and the cold, calculating voice she had overheard to be some terrible misunderstanding. But she could not afford such hope, not anymore. "Thank you," she said simply, rising from her chair. "I should retire for the night. It grows late." Damien nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. As she moved toward the door, his voice stopped her once more. Elena. She turned back, her heart pounding. Whatever comes, he said, his expression unreadable once more. Know that I intend for our child to be well cared for. The words, meant perhaps as reassurance, landed instead like confirmation of everything she already feared. Our child, he said, not once mentioning her own place in that future. She offered a small nod, unable to trust her voice, and left the library without another word. That night, lying awake long after the palace had fallen silent, Elena replayed the conversation over and over, searching for any hidden meaning she might have missed. Had he suspected something? Had her research drawn unwanted attention? Or had it simply been an unusually candid moment between two people who, despite everything, still shared a strange, complicated bond neither fully understood? She did not have answers, but she understood, with growing clarity, that she could no longer afford small mistakes. Every conversation, every reaction, every quiet moment of hesitation carried risk now. The due date drew closer with each passing week, and with it, the moment when Damien's plan would finally be set into motion. She needed to move faster. The following morning, Elena sought out Kian earlier than usual, finding him in the training yard overseeing a group of young guards practicing basic combat drills. She waited patiently at the edge of the yard until he noticed her, then gestured subtly for a private word. Is something wrong? Kian asked, concern immediately evident as he joined her beneath the shade of a nearby tree, away from the guard's hearing. I need to ask you something important, Elena said quietly, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Kian's expression grew serious. Of course. How soon after the pup's birth does your brother intend to move forward with his arrangements? She kept her voice low, watching his face carefully for any reaction. Kian went very still, his eyes widening slightly before he could mask his surprise. How do you... Please, Kian, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her own heart. I already know. I have known for weeks. I heard the two of you speaking, the night you argued about his plan. Kian's face paled visibly. Elena, I am not angry with you, she said quickly, though the words carried more effort than she let show. You tried to reason with him. I heard that too. But I need to know how much time I truly have before he acts. Kian ran a hand through his hair, clearly shaken by the revelation. He intends to move quickly. Within days of the pup's birth, once he is certain the child is healthy and the succession secured. Elena absorbed this, her mind already calculating, adjusting the timeline she had been quietly working toward. Days, not weeks, far less time than she had hoped for. Elena, Kian said, his voice urgent now. Why did you not say something sooner? Why continue pretending? Because pretending gave me time, she said simply. Time to prepare. Time to understand exactly what I would be facing, and what protections I might have against it. Kian studied her with something close to awe now, mixed with lingering guilt. You have been planning this entire time. I had no other choice, Elena said. I could not simply wait to be discarded, Kian. Not with a child depending on me. What do you need from me? Kian asked, his voice steady now, resolute in a way Elena had not heard from him before. She studied him carefully, weighing exactly how much to reveal even now. But something in his expression, the genuine guilt and determination she saw there, convinced her he had truly chosen a side, even if it meant standing against his own brother. I need you to help me understand exactly how the council operates, she said. If it comes to a formal challenge, I need to know how such matters are typically presented, and who among the council might be sympathetic to my position. Kian nodded slowly. There are several council members who have long felt uneasy about how quickly Damien consolidated power after our father's death. They respected our father greatly. If you can show them clear evidence of wrongdoing, rather than simple accusation, I believe several would be willing to hear you out. Evidence, Elena repeated thoughtfully. I have the historical precedent, the parental rights clause. But I have nothing yet that directly proves his current intentions, beyond what we both overheard that night. Kian was quiet for a moment, clearly considering something carefully before he spoke again. There may be a way to secure more direct proof. My brother keeps detailed records of his plans, always has, ever since our father's passing. If there is written correspondence regarding the Northern Pack arrangement he mentioned, it would likely be kept within his private study. Elena's pulse quickened at the possibility. Could you access it? Kian hesitated, clearly torn. It would mean betraying his trust directly, not simply staying silent as I have already done. I understand if you cannot, Elena said gently, though her heart sank slightly at the thought of losing this potential path forward. I do not wish to force you into something that goes against your conscience regarding your own brother. Kian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with visible internal conflict. Finally he spoke, his voice firm despite the difficulty of the decision. No, you are right to seek proof. And I meant what I said in the garden, weeks ago. Not everyone in this palace wishes to see you unhappy. I will find a way to help you, Elena, whatever it costs me with my brother. Relief and gratitude flooded through her, though she was careful not to let it show too openly, aware of the guards still training nearby. Thank you, Kian. Truly. Do not thank me yet, he said quietly. We have not succeeded in anything so far, only agreed to try. Over the following 2 weeks, Elena and Kian worked carefully together, meeting in brief, quiet moments throughout the palace, to share small pieces of information as they gathered them. Kian, using his position and long familiarity with his brother's habits, managed to locate correspondence confirming the arrangement with the Northern Pack, exactly as Damien had described that night in the study. Letters detailing the modest home being prepared, the terms of Elena's expected relocation, and most damning of all, explicit language regarding the termination of her parental rights once she departed. Kian copied the relevant details carefully by hand, unwilling to remove the original documents and risk his brother noticing their absence, and delivered the copies to Elena during one of their now regular morning walks in the garden. Elena read through the copied pages with a mixture of vindication and renewed heartbreak, seeing her worst fears confirmed in Damien's own careful handwriting. But beneath the pain, she felt something else solidifying within her. Certainty. Resolve. And now, finally, real evidence to support the legal challenge she intended to bring before the council when the time came. This is enough, she said quietly, folding the pages carefully and tucking them into a hidden pocket sewn into her cloak. Combined with the parental rights clause, this should be enough to bring before the council. What happens now? Kian asked. Now, Elena said, I wait. I continue as I have been, giving nothing away, until the moment the pup is born and your brother reveals his plan directly to me. Only then will I present what I know, when he believes himself closest to succeeding. Kian studied her with quiet admiration. You are far stronger than my brother ever gave you credit for. He will learn that soon enough, Elena said, a steely determination settling into her voice that had not been there 7 months ago, when she first arrived at Ashgrove Palace as a frightened, hopeful bride. As the days passed and her due date drew ever closer, Elena felt the quiet tension of the palace tightening around her like a held breath. She continued her careful performance, the devoted, unsuspecting mate, attending council gatherings, accepting Damien's dutiful evening visits, allowing the healers to monitor her progress with growing frequency as the pup's arrival approached. But beneath that calm exterior, she remained sharp, watchful, and ready. She had spent months building the foundation she would need. Now, all that remained was the waiting, the final stretch before the confrontation that would determine not only her own future, but the future of the child she had fought so hard to protect. Late one evening, only days before her due date, Elena stood once more at her chamber window, watching the moon rise over the palace grounds, just as she had that first terrible night in the corridor. So much had changed since then. She was no longer the frightened, hopeful girl who had clung desperately to small kindnesses and quiet hopes for affection that would never come. She was ready. Whatever happens, she whispered softly to the sleeping child within her, I will not let him take you from me. I promise you that. With everything I am. Outside, the palace remained silent and still, unaware of the storm quietly gathering within its walls, ready to break the moment the pup finally arrived. 3 days before her due date, Elena woke before dawn to a strange, unfamiliar tightness across her stomach, gone as quickly as it appeared. She lay still for a long moment, listening to her own breathing in the darkness, wondering if she had imagined it. But when the sensation returned 20 minutes later, sharper this time, she understood clearly, that the moment she had spent months preparing for was finally approaching. She did not call for the healers immediately. Instead, she lay quietly in the darkness, one hand resting over her stomach, allowing herself a few final minutes of stillness before the chaos she knew was coming. She thought of everything she had built over the past months, the careful alliances, the hidden evidence, the legal precedent she had uncovered in the depths of the palace library. She thought of Nora's quiet kindness, Edwin's silent protection, and Kian's growing courage in standing against his own brother's wishes. She thought too of Damien, and the strange, complicated tangle of feelings she still carried toward him despite everything. The man who spoke coldly of discarding her one moment, and spoke with unexpected sincerity about her capacity for motherhood the next. She did not understand him fully, not even now, but she understood enough to know that whatever tenderness occasionally surfaced in him would not be enough to stop the plan he had so carefully constructed. When the tightness returned a third time, unmistakable now in its rhythm, Elena finally rose and called for Nora. Word spread quickly through the palace once the healers confirmed that Elena had entered labor. Nora remained steadily at her side throughout the long hours that followed, offering quiet encouragement and gentle reassurance as the pain intensified. Kian, though not permitted in the birthing chamber itself, remained close by throughout the day, pacing the corridor outside with a nervous energy that surprised even himself. Damien arrived partway through the afternoon, having been called back from a meeting with visiting dignitaries the moment word reached him. He did not enter the birthing chamber either, remaining instead in the adjoining sitting room, though Nora later told Elena that he had paced almost as restlessly as Kian throughout the final hours. The pup arrived just after sunset, healthy and strong, with a cry that echoed loudly through the chamber and brought immediate, exhausted tears of relief to Elena's eyes. A daughter, the healers announced, small but robust, with a full head of dark hair much like her father's. Elena held her daughter for the first time with trembling arms, exhaustion and overwhelming love washing over her in equal measure. Whatever fear and calculation had occupied her thoughts throughout the pregnancy, in this moment, holding her child for the first time, none of it mattered beyond the simple, fierce reality of the small life now resting against her chest. "She is beautiful," Nora whispered, wiping tears from her own eyes as she helped settle Elena more comfortably against the pillows. "She is," Elena agreed softly, unable to look away from her daughter's small, sleeping face. When Damien was finally permitted to enter the chamber, he approached slowly, almost hesitantly, his usual composed demeanor cracking slightly at the sight of his daughter for the first time. He knelt beside the bed, studying the small bundle in Elena's arms with an expression she had never seen on him before, something raw and unguarded. "May I?" he asked quietly, and Elena, despite everything, found herself nodding, carefully transferring their daughter into his waiting arms. Damien held his daughter with surprising gentleness, his large hands cradling her small form with a care that seemed to surprise even him. For a long moment, he simply stared down at her, something shifting visibly behind his composed exterior. "She has your eyes," he said quietly, glancing up at Elena. "She has your hair," Elena replied, watching him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of the calculating coldness she knew still lay somewhere beneath this tender moment. "What shall we name her?" Damien asked, and something in his voice suggested this question, at least, carried genuine warmth. They settled, after some quiet discussion, on the name Sophie, a name Elena had always loved, meaning wisdom, which felt fitting given everything her daughter's arrival had already demanded of her mother. Damien seemed pleased with the choice, repeating the name softly as he continued to hold his daughter, clearly reluctant to relinquish her, even as the healers gently suggested Elena needed rest. For a brief, fragile moment, watching Damien's genuine tenderness toward their newborn daughter, Elena allowed herself to wonder if perhaps things might be different now. Perhaps becoming a father would soften whatever fear and calculation drove his earlier plans. Perhaps this moment of unguarded warmth signaled a genuine shift in him. But that fragile hope shattered only 2 days later. Elena was resting in her chambers, Sophie sleeping peacefully in the small cradle beside her bed, when Damien entered, his expression once again composed and formal, the tenderness she had witnessed at Sophie's birth, carefully tucked away behind his usual mask. "Elena," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed, "I wanted to speak with you about your recovery, and what comes next." Elena's heart began pounding, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. Of course. The healers believe you should have several weeks of quiet rest, away from the demands of court life, Damien continued, his tone measured and careful, exactly as she remembered from that night in the study. I have arranged for you to recover at a peaceful estate to the north, where you will want for nothing. There it was, exactly as Kian had described, exactly as she had spent months preparing for. For how long? Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the storm rising within her. As long as necessary, Damien said, and something in his careful phrasing confirmed everything she already knew. Sophie will remain here, of course, where she can begin learning her role as heir under proper guidance. You intend to separate me from my daughter, Elena said quietly, no longer bothering to disguise the sharp edge entering her voice. Damien's expression flickered with something like surprise at her directness, though he recovered quickly. I intend for what is best for the pack, and for Sophie's future. This is simply how such matters are typically handled. Is it? Elena asked, rising slowly from the bed despite her exhaustion, moving to stand before him with a composure that clearly unsettled him. Or is this simply what you decided, weeks before Sophie was even born, when you told your brother exactly how you planned to get rid of me? Damien went very still, all color draining from his face. What did you say? I heard you, Damien, Elena said, her voice steady and clear now, months of careful preparation finally reaching this moment. That night, in your study, when you told Kian your plan. The northern pack, the modest home. Stripping my parental rights while keeping Sophie here. I heard every word. For a long moment, Damien said nothing, clearly stunned by the revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual composed authority. You have known this entire time? Since before Sophie was even born, Elena confirmed. I have known, and I have prepared. Prepared how? Damien asked, something like genuine alarm entering his expression now. Elena moved to the small writing desk in the corner of her chambers, retrieving the hidden folder she had kept carefully concealed since Kian first delivered the copied correspondence weeks earlier. She placed it firmly on the table between them. I have copies of your correspondence with the Northern Pack, she said, written in your own hand, detailing exactly the plan you described that night. I also have historical precedent from your own family's founding laws, guaranteeing parental rights for any mate who bears an alpha's heir, regardless of the marriage's continuation. A precedent that has been upheld by the council before. Damien stared at the folder, then back at Elena, disbelief, and something that might have been reluctant respect warring across his features. You have been planning this since before her birth. I had no other choice, Elena said, echoing the same words she had once spoken to Kian in the training yard weeks earlier. I would not simply wait to be discarded, Damien, not with our daughter's future at stake. Kian helped you, Damien said, understanding dawning slowly. He copied these documents. He tried to reason with you first, Elena said. You refused to listen. What did you expect him to do? Watch silently while you carried out a plan that would tear his niece from her mother? Damien sank slowly into the nearby chair, the folder still resting on the table before him, his composed exterior finally cracking entirely under the weight of everything Elena had just revealed. I never intended to be cruel, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. I believed I was protecting the pack, protecting Sophie's future stability. You were protecting yourself, Elena said, not unkindly, but with a clarity months of careful observation had earned her. From vulnerability, from the fear of caring for someone and losing them, the way you lost your father. Damien looked up at her sharply, something raw and exposed in his expression now. You cannot know that. Kian told me enough about who you were before your father's death, Elena said gently, the man who laughed, who made time for things beyond duty. I do not believe that man disappeared entirely, Damien. I believe you buried him, out of fear, the moment you took the throne. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither had said aloud until this moment. Finally, Damien spoke again, his voice quieter, more uncertain than Elena had ever heard from him. What do you intend to do with what you know? Elena studied him carefully before answering. I intend to bring this before the council, Damien. Not out of cruelty, but because I will not allow Sophie's future to be decided by fear, rather than genuine care. I will not allow myself to be discarded, as though I were nothing more than a vessel who served her purpose. The council, Damien repeated, understanding the full weight of what such a challenge would mean for his authority, his reputation, among the Pax who had trusted his leadership since his father's passing. Unless, Elena continued carefully, watching him closely, you are willing to reconsider, not simply for the sake of avoiding scandal, but because you genuinely wish to be part of Sophie's life, and mine, in a way built on honesty rather than calculation. Damien was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the folder on the table, the evidence of his own carefully constructed plan laid bare before him. When he finally looked up at Elena again, something had shifted in his expression, uncertain and vulnerable, in a way she had never witnessed from him before. I do not know how to be the man you are describing, he admitted quietly. I have spent so long building walls, I am not certain I remember how to live without them. Then perhaps, Elena said softly, it is time you learned, not for my sake alone, but for Sophie's. Sophie, as if sensing the significance of the moment, stirred in her cradle, a small, sleepy sound drawing both their attention. Damien rose slowly, moving to stand beside the cradle, looking down at his daughter with the same raw tenderness Elena had witnessed the day of her birth. I do not want to lose either of you, he said quietly, not looking away from Sophie's small, peaceful face. I convinced myself it would be simpler this way, safer. I was wrong. Elena studied him carefully, aware that words alone, however sincere, would not be enough to undo months of careful preparation and hard-won caution on her part. Sincerity means little without action, Damien. If you truly wish to change course, it must be reflected in how you proceed from here. Openly, honestly, before the council, and before your own people. What would you have me do? Damien asked, meeting her gaze directly now. Acknowledge the truth, Elena said firmly, before the council, and before the pack. Not simply quietly abandon the plan, and hope the matter fades from memory, but genuinely account for the harm such a plan would have caused, and commit openly to a different path forward. Damien was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the difficulty of what she asked against the alternative she had already prepared to pursue without his cooperation. Finally, he nodded slowly. I will do as you ask, he said, whatever it costs my pride, or my authority among the council. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint of calculation beneath his words, but what she found instead was something closer to genuine humility, hard-won and uncertain, but real. Then we will face the council together, she said, and we will see what comes next. The council chamber had never felt so vast to Elena as it did the morning she stood before it, Sophie held securely in her arms, waiting for the assembled elders and territory representatives to settle into their seats. Word had spread quickly through the palace that something significant was to be addressed, and the chamber was fuller than usual, curious murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd as Damien took his place at the head of the room. Kian stood quietly near the side of the chamber, his expression tense but resolute, having agreed to speak if called upon to confirm the details he had witnessed and the documents he had helped copy. Nora and Edwin, though not permitted within the formal proceedings, waited anxiously in the corridor outside, having offered their own quiet support to Elena in the hours leading up to this moment. Damien rose first, addressing the assembled council with a composure that only barely masked the difficulty of what he was about to admit. Elena watched him carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation or retreat from the commitment he had made 2 days earlier. But his voice, when he spoke, remained steady and clear. I have called this gathering, Damien began, not to celebrate the birth of my daughter, as tradition might expect, but to address a serious matter of my own conduct, one that requires honesty before this council and before our people. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, confusion and curiosity evident on the faces of the assembled elders. Damien continued, his voice carrying clearly, despite the difficulty evident beneath his composed exterior. In the weeks before my daughter's birth, I made plans, discussed privately with my brother, to remove my mate from the palace following the birth, stripping her of parental rights and relocating her under false pretenses. I believed, at the time, that such measures would protect the stability of our succession and our territory's reputation among allied pacts. The murmurs grew louder now, several council members exchanging visibly alarmed glances. an elder near the front of the chamber. A stern-looking woman Elena recognized as Counselor Beatrice, one of the longest-serving members of the council, rose slowly to her feet. "You intended to strip a mother of her parental rights," Beatrice said, her voice sharp with evident disapproval, "based on nothing more than administrative convenience?" "Yes," Damien admitted, not flinching from the accusation, despite the visible difficulty it clearly caused him. "I was wrong to consider such a course of action. My mate discovered my plan before it could be carried out, and confronted me directly with both moral objection and legal precedent I had failed to properly consider." Elena stepped forward now, Sophie still held securely against her chest, addressing the council directly for the first time. "I would like to present the council with historical precedent regarding this matter," she said, her voice clear and steady, despite the weight of every gaze now fixed upon her. "A clause established generations ago, within this very pact's founding laws, guaranteeing parental rights for any mate who bears an alpha's heir, regardless of the marriage's continuation. This precedent was previously upheld by this council in a similar dispute." She presented the documentation she had carefully prepared, the historical passage from the founding laws, along with the copied correspondence confirming Damien's original plan. Several council members examined the documents closely, quiet discussion breaking out among smaller groups as the significance of the evidence settled over the chamber. Counselor Beatrice studied the documents carefully, before addressing Damien directly once more. "You would have violated your own family's founding laws, Alpha Damien, laws established specifically to protect against exactly this kind of injustice." "I would have," Damien confirmed quietly, "had my mate not discovered the plan and prevented it." Another council member, an older man named Counselor Whitmore who had served alongside Damien's father for many years, rose slowly to his feet, his expression grave. "Your father built this territory's reputation on fairness and protection for those under his care, particularly those without power to protect themselves. What you describe stands in direct opposition to everything he stood for." "I am aware," Damien said, and something genuine and raw entered his voice now, the weight of his father's legacy clearly bearing down on him in this moment. "I convinced myself that strength required coldness, that vulnerability threatened stability. I was wrong, and I stand before this council now to correct that course, publicly and completely." The discussion that followed stretched on for nearly an hour, council members raising questions, examining evidence, and debating the appropriate response to such a serious breach of both moral and legal expectation. Elena remained standing throughout, Sophie occasionally stirring in her arms, watching carefully as the balance of power she had spent months carefully constructing finally played out before the very body capable of enforcing real consequences. Kian was called upon to confirm the details of the conversation he had witnessed and the documents he had helped secure, which he did without hesitation, his testimony carrying particular weight, given his position as the king's own brother, willingly speaking against him in service of what he believed to be right. Finally, Counselor Beatrice addressed the chamber as a whole, her tone firm and decisive. "This council formally recognizes the parental rights clause as binding and enforceable in this matter. Lady Elena retains full parental rights over her daughter Sophie, regardless of any future changes to her marriage status. Furthermore, this council expects Alpha Damien to demonstrate, through consistent future conduct, genuine commitment to the values his father established for this territory." Damien bowed his head slightly, accepting the council's ruling without protest. "I accept the council's judgment, and I thank them for holding me accountable to standards I nearly failed to uphold." As the formal proceedings concluded and the council members began filing out of the chamber, quiet conversations rippling among them regarding the significance of what had just transpired. Elena remained standing near the front of the room, Sophie now beginning to fuss softly in her arms, ready for feeding and rest. Damien approached slowly, his expression a complicated mixture of relief, humility, and something that looked almost like renewed hope. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for choosing to confront this before the council, rather than simply leaving without confrontation." "I did not do it for your benefit alone," Elena said honestly, gently soothing Sophie as she continued to fuss. "I did it because Sophie deserves parents who are honest, both with each other and with themselves, about what genuine care requires." "I understand that now," Damien said, more clearly than I did even 2 days ago. Elena studied him carefully, aware that a single council ruling and a moment of public accountability, however significant, would not undo months of careful distance and calculated coldness overnight. Trust, she understood, would need to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent action, rather than a single dramatic gesture. "This is only the beginning, Damien," she said quietly. "Words spoken before the council mean little if they are not reflected in how you choose to live each day going forward." "I know," Damien said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I am prepared to prove that, however long it takes." As Elena turned to leave the chamber, Sophie settling slightly against her shoulder, Kian approached quietly, his expression carrying visible relief now that the difficult testimony was behind him. "You did remarkably well in there," he said softly. "We did well," Elena corrected gently. "I could not have gathered what I needed without your help, Kian, whatever it cost you with your brother." "He does not blame me," Kian said, glancing toward Damien, who remained in quiet conversation with several departing council members. "If anything, I believe he is grateful, in his own complicated way, that someone was willing to stand against him when he could not see his own error clearly." Elena nodded, understanding the strange, complicated dynamics that existed between the brothers, bonds of loyalty and love that persisted, even through significant conflict and disagreement. "What happens now, do you think? Between the Pax, the allied territories who might question this whole situation?" Kian considered this carefully. "There will be questions, certainly. Some may see this as weakness on Damien's part, admitting fault so publicly. But I believe, in time, many will see it differently. As strength, actually. The willingness to acknowledge error and correct course, rather than continuing down a harmful path simply to preserve appearances." "I hope you are right," Elena said softly, glancing down at Sophie, now finally settling into peaceful sleep against her shoulder. As she made her way back toward her chambers, the weight of everything that had just transpired, slowly beginning to settle over her, Elena found herself reflecting on the long months since that terrible night in the corridor, when she first overheard Damien's plan. She thought of the fear and grief that had nearly overwhelmed her in those early days, and the careful, deliberate resolve she had built in their place. She had not simply survived the plan constructed to discard her. She had confronted it directly, armed with knowledge, allies, and a foundation of justice rooted in the very traditions the Pact claimed to honor. Whatever came next, whatever complicated path lay ahead in rebuilding trust with Damien, she understood clearly now that she would not face it as a powerless bride waiting to be discarded. She would face it as Sophie's mother, strong, capable, and unwilling to be moved by anything less than genuine honesty and care. And for the first time since her arrival at Ashgrove Palace nearly a year ago, Elena felt something she had not expected to feel again so soon. Hope, carefully earned, rather than naively given. News of the council's ruling spread quickly beyond the palace walls, reaching allied territories within days, and with it came the complicated wave of reactions Kian had predicted. Some neighboring alphas sent formal messages questioning Damien's fitness to rule, suggesting that a leader who required correction from his own council could not be trusted to maintain stability across contested borders. Others, more surprisingly, sent messages of quiet respect, acknowledging the difficulty of publicly admitting fault, and suggesting that such accountability, rare among ruling alphas, might actually strengthen rather than weaken the territory's standing in the long run. Elena observed these developments carefully from the relative quiet of her chambers, spending most of her days focused on Sophie's care, while the political fallout continued to unfold around them. She had expected some difficulty following the council's ruling, but the intensity of certain reactions still caught her somewhat off guard. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the council proceedings, Damien requested a private meeting with her, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately put her on alert. "The Northern Pack has withdrawn their trade agreement," he said without preamble, once they were settled in her private sitting room, Sophie sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby. "They claim the council's ruling demonstrates instability within our leadership." Elena absorbed this news carefully. "The same Northern Pack you had arranged to relocate me to?" Something flickered across Damien's face, guilt still evidently present despite the weeks that had passed since the council proceedings. "The same," he confirmed quietly. It seems their willingness to accept the original arrangement was tied more closely to expanding their own influence within our territory than any genuine concern for your well-being. I am not surprised, Elena said honestly. Men who agree to such arrangements rarely do so out of kindness. Damien nodded, though the weight of the political consequences clearly pressed heavily on him. Councillor Whitmore believes we can secure alternative trade arrangements with the Eastern Territories, but it will take time, and will likely cost us more favorable terms than we previously held. Do you regret it? Elena asked carefully. The ruling, the public accountability, given the difficulties it has caused? Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously, rather than offering a quick, reassuring answer. No, he said finally. I regret the plan that made such accountability necessary in the first place, but I do not regret facing the consequences honestly, rather than continuing to hide behind calculated coldness. Elena studied him carefully, noting the genuine consideration behind his answer, rather than simple performance for her benefit. In the weeks since the council proceedings, she had watched him carefully, searching for consistency between his words and his actions, aware that trust could not be rebuilt through declarations alone. She had noticed small changes. He visited Sophie daily now, not simply out of dutiful obligation, but with genuine warmth, often lingering far longer than necessary, engaging in quiet conversation with Elena about their daughter's development, her small changes and growing personality. He had also begun, cautiously, sharing more of the burdens of leadership with her, discussing council matters and territorial concerns in ways he had never done during her pregnancy. It was not, Elena understood, a complete transformation. Damien remained a man shaped by years of guarded fear and calculated distance, and such patterns did not disappear entirely within a matter of weeks. But the effort, consistent and genuine, had begun slowly rebuilding something between them that Elena had not expected to feel again. Kian, too, had settled into a new rhythm within the palace, his relationship with his brother gradually mending, despite the significant strain the council proceedings had placed upon it. He continued his close friendship with Elena as well, though with a new layer of mutual respect and understanding, forged through the difficult months of careful planning they had shared together. It was during one such quiet afternoon, several weeks after the Northern Pact's withdrawal, that Elena found herself walking through the garden with Nora, Sophie resting peacefully in a small carrier strapped securely against Elena's chest. You seem more at peace than I have seen you in a very long time, Nora observed, studying Elena, with the same warm perceptiveness she had shown from their very first meeting, nearly a year ago. I feel more at peace, Elena admitted, glancing down at her sleeping daughter, though I do not think the difficulties are entirely behind us. No, Nora agreed. But you have built something real here, Elena. Not simply survival, but genuine strength, that will carry you through whatever difficulties remain. Elena smiled softly at the older woman's words, grateful, as she had been so many times throughout the past year, for Nora's steady, unwavering kindness. I could not have managed any of this without you, Nora. Your friendship meant more than you likely realize. Nora squeezed her hand warmly. You would have found your way regardless, dear. You have always carried more strength than you gave yourself credit for. As the weeks continued to pass, the political fallout from the council's ruling gradually stabilized. New trade arrangements secured with the Eastern Territories under Councillor Whitmore's careful negotiation, and the immediate crisis surrounding the Northern Pact's withdrawal, slowly settling into manageable difficulty, rather than catastrophic instability. Damien's willingness to publicly acknowledge and correct his error, while initially costly, gradually began earning him a quieter, more genuine form of respect among several allied territories, exactly as Kian had predicted. Elena, for her part, continued rebuilding her own place within the palace, no longer the naive, hopeful bride who had arrived nearly a year ago, nor the carefully guarded, calculating woman who had spent months preparing for confrontation. She had become something new, someone shaped by both experiences, capable of genuine warmth, without abandoning the hard-won wisdom that had allowed her to protect herself and her daughter when it mattered most. One evening, several months after Sophie's birth, Damien found Elena in the garden as the sun began setting behind the palace walls, casting warm golden light across the flowering shrubs Nora's staff maintained so carefully. Sophie, now old enough to giggle and reach curiously toward the colorful blooms surrounding her, sat contentedly in Elena's lap as she rested on their familiar stone bench. "May I join you?" Damien asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that had become more consistent over the recent months, though never entirely losing the careful formality that remained part of his fundamental nature. "Of course," Elena said, shifting slightly to make room beside her. Damien settled onto the bench, reaching out carefully to let Sophie wrap her small fingers around his own, something he had done countless times over recent weeks, each time with the same evident, quiet wonder at the simple connection. "I received word today," he said, after a comfortable silence, "that Counselor Beatrice intends to formally document the parental rights ruling as permanent precedent, ensuring it cannot be challenged or overlooked by future generations of our family." Elena absorbed this news with quiet satisfaction. That is good. It should have always been protected clearly, rather than left as obscure historical text easily forgotten. "You are right," Damien agreed. "I should have known our own founding laws better than I did. I have no excuse beyond my own fear and poor judgment." Elena studied him for a long moment, watching the sincere weight behind his words. "You have grown, Damien, since Sophie's birth, since the council proceedings." "I have tried to," he said quietly. "Though I know words and effort alone cannot fully undo the pain I nearly caused you." "No," Elena agreed honestly. "But they matter, nonetheless. Consistent effort, sustained over time, is how trust rebuilds. Not through grand gestures alone, but through the quiet, ordinary choices made every day." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing her words with evident thoughtfulness. "I would like," he said carefully, "to continue earning that trust, if you are willing to allow it." Elena considered his words carefully, aware of how far they had both traveled since that terrible night in the corridor nearly a year ago. She thought of the fear and grief she had carried in those early months, the careful, deliberate resolve she had built to protect herself and Sophie, and the slow, genuine transformation she had witnessed in Damien since the council's ruling forced him to confront the harm his calculated coldness had nearly caused. "I am willing," she said finally, watching Sophie giggle happily as she continued exploring Damien's fingers with evident delight. "Not because the pain of what you planned has disappeared entirely, but because I have watched you choose, consistently, to become someone different since then. That matters, Damien. It matters a great deal." Something in Damien's expression eased visibly at her words, relief and quiet hope, evident in a way that reminded Elena, briefly, of the raw tenderness she had witnessed the day Sophie was born. As the sun continued setting behind the palace walls, casting long golden shadows across the garden where Elena had first begun quietly building the resolve and strength that would ultimately protect her and her daughter, she allowed herself, cautiously and deliberately, to imagine a future built not on naive hope alone, but on hard-won trust, carefully and consistently earned. Whatever challenges remained ahead, political or personal, Elena understood now, with a clarity that had cost her dearly to earn, that she would face them as exactly who she had become. Not the frightened, hopeful girl who first arrived at Ashgrove Palace, nor the guarded, calculating woman who had spent months preparing for confrontation, but someone stronger, wiser, and entirely capable of building a genuine life for herself and her daughter, regardless of whatever the future still held in store. A full year had passed since the night Elena first stood frozen outside Damien's study door, and as she stood now in that very same corridor, watching Sophie take her first wobbling steps across the polished stone floor, she found herself reflecting on just how completely her life had transformed since that painful, pivotal moment. Sophie, now walking with increasing confidence despite frequent tumbles that ended in delighted giggles rather than tears, had become the bright, joyful center of palace life, adored not only by her parents, but by the wider household as well. Nora doted on her endlessly, sneaking her small treats from the kitchen despite Elena's gentle protests. Edwin, still faithfully stationed near the family's chambers each evening, had become something of an honorary protector, often found teaching Sophie simple words for the guards and weapons she found endlessly fascinating. And Kian, who had risked so much to help Elena during those difficult early months, had become the doting Uncle Sophie adored above almost everyone else, save for her own parents. The political tensions that had followed the council's ruling had, over the following months, largely settled into manageable stability. The Eastern Territories had proven reliable trade partners, ultimately offering more favorable terms than the Northern Pack ever had, and several other allied alphas had, as Kian predicted, come to view Damien's public accountability as a mark of genuine strength rather than weakness, strengthening rather than damaging the territory's broader reputation over time. Damien himself had continued the slow, consistent transformation Elena had witnessed, beginning in the months following Sophie's birth. He remained, in many ways, the same careful, measured man he had always been, shaped permanently by the early loss of his father and the weight of leadership thrust upon him at such a young age. But the calculated coldness that had once defined so much of his approach to both leadership and personal relationships had gradually softened into something more genuine, more willing to acknowledge vulnerability rather than guard against it entirely. He had become, Elena reflected, as she watched him now crouching low to catch Sophie as she stumbled toward him with an excited squeal, a father who made time each day for his daughter, regardless of the demands of leadership, a partner who consulted her genuinely on matters both large and small, and slowly, carefully, a husband in more than simple obligation alone. She grows faster every day, Damien said, lifting Sophie easily into his arms as Elena approached, smiling warmly at the familiar scene. She does, Elena agreed, reaching out to gently smooth Sophie's dark hair, so similar to her father's. Soon she will be running through these halls faster than any of us can keep up with. Then we shall simply have to keep up, Damien said, pressing a gentle kiss to Sophie's forehead as she giggled happily in his arms. They walked together toward the garden, their familiar evening routine that had become, over the past year, one of Elena's favorite parts of each day. The palace around them, once a place of quiet loneliness and calculated distance, had gradually transformed into something that finally felt, to Elena, genuinely like home. She thought back, as she often did during these peaceful evening walks, to the months of careful planning and quiet resolve that had brought her to this point. The night she overheard Damien's plan, the careful alliances she built with Nora, Edwin, and eventually Kian, the historical precedent she uncovered in the depths of the palace library, and the difficult, necessary confrontation before the council that had ultimately changed the course of everything that followed. She did not regret the difficult path that had led her here. If anything, she understood now, with the clarity that only hindsight could provide, that the strength and wisdom she had been forced to develop during those months of careful preparation had become the very foundation upon which everything good in her current life now rested. She had not simply survived Damien's original plan to discard her. She had transformed the crisis into an opportunity to build something far stronger and more genuine than the naive hope she had originally carried when she first arrived at Ashgrove Palace. "I have been thinking," Damien said, as they settled onto their familiar stone bench, Sophie now toddling happily among the flowering shrubs under Nora's watchful eye nearby, about formally acknowledging the anniversary of the council's ruling. Not as a celebration of the difficulty that led to it, but as a reminder, for myself and for our people, of the importance of accountability and genuine partnership within leadership. Elena considered this thoughtfully. That could be meaningful, a reminder that strength and vulnerability are not opposites, but can exist together. "Exactly," Damien said. "I want our territory to be known not simply for stability through control, as my father once believed necessary, nor through the calculated coldness I once mistakenly embraced myself, but through genuine partnership and accountability. The kind you taught me, Elena, through your own strength and refusal to be simply discarded." Elena studied him carefully, moved by the sincerity evident in his words. "You have taught me a great deal as well, Damien, about the courage it takes to acknowledge fault, and the genuine effort required to rebuild trust once it has been damaged." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Sophie's delighted exploration of the garden, the golden evening light casting long shadows across the same grounds where Elena had first begun quietly building the resolve that would ultimately protect both herself and her daughter. "Do you ever think about what might have happened?" Damien asked quietly after a while. "If you had confronted me immediately, that very night, rather than waiting and preparing as carefully as you did?" Elena considered the question seriously. "I think, had I confronted you immediately, you would have simply found another way to carry out your plan more quietly. You were not yet ready, that night, to hear the truth of what such a plan would have cost you. Cost us both. I needed time to build something strong enough to force genuine reckoning, rather than simply delaying the same outcome." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom behind her careful strategy. Wisdom that had ultimately protected not only herself and Sophie, but had also, in its own difficult way, protected Damien from becoming permanently the man his fear and grief had nearly shaped him into. "I am grateful," he said quietly, "for your patience and strength, even when I did not deserve it." "We are both here now," Elena said gently, resting her hand over his. "That is what matters most." As the sun continued its slow descent behind the palace walls, casting the garden in warm, golden light, Sophie's delighted laughter echoing softly through the peaceful evening air, Elena allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to embrace the life she had fought so carefully to build. Not the naive, hopeful existence she had once imagined as a frightened young bride, nor the guarded, calculating survival she had constructed during those difficult months of careful preparation, but something far richer and more genuine. A life built on hard-won trust, consistent effort, and the fierce, unwavering strength of a mother who had refused, against every expectation placed upon her, to be simply discarded. Nora approached quietly, as the evening began settling into dusk, gently reminding them that Sophie would soon need her evening meal and rest. Elena rose from the bench, watching as Damien scooped their daughter into his arms once more, her small giggles echoing warmly through the garden as they made their way back toward the palace together. Kian met them near the garden entrance, having just finished overseeing evening training for the palace guards, his easy smile widening as Sophie reached eagerly toward him, insisting on being transferred into her favorite uncle's arms for the remainder of the walk back inside. "How was your evening?" Kian asked, settling Sophie comfortably against his shoulder as they walked together. "Peaceful," Elena said, glancing warmly between Damien and Kian, grateful beyond words for the unexpected, hard-won family she had built within these palace walls. "Wonderfully peaceful." As they made their way back through the corridors that had once held such painful memory for Elena, the very same halls where she had once stood frozen with grief and disbelief outside a closed study door, she found herself smiling genuinely, without reservation, at just how completely her life had transformed since that difficult night nearly a year ago. She had entered this palace as a frightened bride, uncertain of her place or her worth within a marriage built on obligation rather than genuine choice. She had nearly been discarded, quietly and cruelly, by a husband too afraid of vulnerability to recognize the value of what stood before him. But through careful strength, patient resolve, and the courage to confront injustice rather than simply accept it, Elena had transformed not only her own fate, but the fate of the man who had once planned to discard her, and the future of the daughter they now both cherished beyond measure. She had refused to be moved. And in refusing, she had built something far more valuable than the naive hope she once carried. She had built a genuine home, rooted not in obligation or fear, but in hard-won trust, mutual respect, and the fierce, unwavering love of a mother who had fought fiercely for her place, and won. The corridor stretched quietly before them as they walked, Sophie's contented babbling echoing softly against the stone walls, and Elena felt, for the first time since her arrival at Ashgrove Palace so long ago, completely and genuinely at peace. She was home.